I got to tell you, when Mitt Romney picked Paul Ryan to be his vice presidential candidate, I was super excited. I mean, way too excited, because putting Paul Ryan on the ticket meant one thing. Meant budget talk, and I love talking about budgets. In particular, I love talking about Paul Ryan's budget because I have had to spend more time trying to understand it than any human being really should have. But I've been disappointed because since Paul Ryan was tapped to be Mitt's number 2, since he was tapped to be the Robin to Romney's Batman, the executive vice president to Romney's CEO, we haven't gotten a lot of budget talk. What we've gotten is a lot of Medicare talk.
I think so far in the past week, the real news has been they've been talking Medicare.
Paul Ryan has taken the courageous steps to bring this issue to the forefront.
He really opens up the Medicare debate.
Paul Ryan's Medicare proposal is going to be front and center.
I think people are finally relieved that there's someone with the political courage to have this discussion. No one's had the guts to do it until Paul Ryan actually came along.
You know the weird thing about this focus on Medicare? Paul Ryan's budget isn't particularly focused on Medicare. And that's even truer for Mitt Romney's budget, which really isn't focused on Medicare, at least in the short term. In the next decade, Paul Ryan's most recent budget keeps the Medicare cuts that President Obama passed as part of the Affordable Care Act. And looking, that's pretty much it. The voucher system you've heard about, that happens, but it doesn't happen for 10 years. So it doesn't happen until after the hypothetical Romney-Ryan presidency has hypothetically ended its hypothetical second term. Hypothetically, of course. As a general rule in politics, if you've got two guys from the Republican Party running for president on a platform, says you can't cut even $1 from Medicare for current retirees, but they're saying they'll pass legislation that will completely remake Medicare in a really unpopular way for the generation of retirees that'll come after they leave office, just trust us. You may not want to assume that policy is a total lock. But here's the thing. Ryan says his budget cuts more than $5 trillion in the next decade. Less than $1 trillion of that is coming from Medicare. Romney says his budget cuts about $7 trillion from the budget over the next decade, and not $1, not a dime, not a penny comes from Medicare. And neither Romney nor Ryan want to cut Social Security, and both want to increase spending on defense. Okay, so what does that leave? If you're not cutting Medicare or Social Security or defense, you want trillions of dollars of cuts, you've already taken more than half of the federal budget off the table. But you know what's mainly left, the big pot of money you can still cut? Programs for poor people. And so if you look at Ryan's specific cuts, if you look at where his money really comes from, a big chunk of it is programs for poor people. In fact, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that more than $6 of every $10 Ryan cuts from the federal budget is coming from programs for the poor. Take Medicaid. Ryan cuts nearly $1.4 trillion from Medicaid over the next 10 years. That is a 34% cut, more than a third, to the program's expected spending over the next decade. Those cuts, unlike the cuts to Medicare, are specific and they begin immediately. Estimates from the nonpartisan Urban Institute suggest that if they are made, about 30 million people could lose their health insurance. Many of them, by the way, children. Oh, and Ryan repeals the Affordable Care Act, too. That's where some of his Medicaids come from. But he also knocks out all the subsidies for lower-income Americans to get private health care insurance. So that's another 15 million or so people who would have had health insurance and are not getting it. So under Ryan's budget, one of the ways it saves money, the big way maybe, is about 45 million people will lose health insurance that they otherwise would have gotten, or their coverage would become much worse. And for the poor here, the hits keep coming. Ryan's budget cuts $134 billion from food stamps, which is enough to kick about 8 to 10 million people off of the program. Food stamps. Ryan cuts $166 billion from the portion of the budget that houses our education, training, employment, and social services. We don't know exactly how he'd apportion those cuts, but the documents he's released suggest a big chunk of them are going to hit Pell Grants. And you can just keep going with this down the line. Everything we know, meanwhile, suggests that Mitt Romney's on the same page as his running mate. It's actually important to remember, Romney's budget is much more aggressive than Ryan's. It's less specific, and so it gets kind of less attention, but it's much more aggressive. Ryan's got about $5.3 trillion in cuts over the next decade. Romney's looking for $7 trillion, and he's not keeping Ryan and Obama's Medicare savings, so now he needs almost $8 trillion in cuts, and he's increasing spending on defense, so it just keeps going up. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, to make Romney's numbers add up, you have to assume that by the end of his presidency, Mitt Romney will have cut every single federal program that is not Medicare, Social Security, or defense by 57%. Every program, not Medicare, Medicaid, not Medicare or Social Security or defense, by 57%. Now, because I live in the real world, I don't assume he's going to do that. I assume Mitt Romney's budget is a fantasy meant to trick Republicans who haven't looked closely at the numbers, and it's never, ever going to happen. When Romney does talk spending cuts, he tends to focus, giving me more evidence, on things like repealing Obamacare, privatizing Amtrak, cutting arts funding, and ending subsidies for Planned Parenthood. Go to his website under spending cuts. You'll see what I mean. Whatever you think of those programs, repealing Obamacare increases the deficit, and the others are rounding errors in the federal budget. But when Romney gets kind of serious, even though he's still pretty vague, the big categories he identifies for cuts, and I'm quoting here from his economic speech in Detroit, are Medicaid and food stamps, housing subsidies, and job training. So that's the reality of the Ryan Romney budgets. You turn Medicare into a voucher program in the future, you spend more on defense now, and you cut the hell out of programs for the poor to pay for it. And they need to do this in part because they simply refuse to raise taxes. If you believe their pledges and their budgets, they would prefer to cut health care for the poor by trillions of dollars and to raise taxes on the rich by even a penny. That is their budget. That is what their numbers say, and that should be the conversation we're having. Or at least it should be part of it. Joining me now to have that conversation is Jared Bernstein, former chief economist and economics advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, now a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and an MSNBC contributor. Jared, it's good to see you, and name off your many titles.
Thank you, Ezra. Nice to be here.
You know these numbers better than me. So what have I missed? What have I gotten wrong or incomplete?
Well, you did a very thorough accounting. I mean, the only thing I would add is that you were actually a tiny bit generous on their tax cut agenda. It's not merely that these guys make the Bush tax cuts permanent. It's that they double down on them. If you think of the Bush tax cuts as costing something like maybe 4.3 trillion over 10 years, they're talking about adding another set of tax cuts that are equal in magnitude to those. So this is why we at the center have talked about this as Robin Hood in reverse on steroids. It's not just that you're cutting programs for the poor so deeply, as you just expressed, that it really strains credulity. It's that at the same time, you're cutting the heck out of taxes, particularly of those at the very high end of the income scale. So it's really quite otherworldly.
So every time, this gets to actually something I really would like to talk about with you. Every time we talk about the Romney and Ryan budgets in the press, every time you see a graph showing what they do to the budget, what is basically embedded in that, what is being assumed every time you hear about their deficit reduction is that they take these tax plans, which above and beyond the Bush tax cuts are trillions of dollars. I believe Paul Ryan's is in the $4 trillion range, if I'm not misremembering.
They're both above $4 trillion.
They just tell you they won't cost any money. They just tell the Congressional Budget Office, who scores these things, they won't cost any money. And they don't say how. All they say is that we will cut other parts of the tax code, deductions and loopholes and exclusions and the like, in order to pay for it. To pay for Paul Ryan's tax code, you would need to cut almost every tax break in the code out. No more mortgage interest deduction, employer health care deductions, state and local tax deductions. And this from a Republican Party that for decades now has refused to pay for taxes. So I don't see how you can buy that. I don't see how you can say, until they actually name these cuts, which they haven't, that these tax plans are deficit neutral.
Correct.
And if they're not, these plans blow up the deficit.
Right. It's interesting because they've actually, as you said, particularly Paul Ryan and particularly regarding programs for the poor, they've actually been fairly specific on their spending cuts, at least, again, as it invokes cuts for programs that help economically vulnerable families. They've been extremely vague on how they're going to offset the revenue losses from their tax cuts. Now, there was an exercise done, and I know you know about this because you wrote it up very, very nicely, by a nonpartisan group here called the Tax Policy Center. And they asked the following question. Suppose you took all the loopholes, all the tax expenditures currently enjoyed by the richest folks who benefit the most from Ryan and Romney's tax cuts, and you ended all of those loopholes. Would you by that kind of experiment, be able to offset those revenue losses from those tax cuts? And the answer they found is no. So here it even gets a little worse. Not only would you be living through all those cuts you just mentioned on the spending side, but if you really want to make those tax cuts revenue neutral, you would actually have to raise taxes on middle and low income households.
Yeah, and people have gone to the Romney campaign and said, how will this work? And they just don't really have an answer. But if they do have an answer, Jared Bernstein, you're going to be one of the first people I ask if it makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ezra. Bye-bye.
Coming up, a trashy new economic study, pun, shows how our waste is tied to GDP growth. I'll sift through all the garbage, another pun, and bring you the numbers next.